Good afternoon, everyone. It's Tony Consul here in Geneva, Director of Communications with IATA. It's great to have you join us for this press briefing again. We have a special lineup this week. We have Brian Pearce, who will be giving us some analysis on the third and fourth quarters of this year. We have our medical advisor, Dr. Powell, who will be helping us work through some of the issues with COVID-19 testing. And then we'll have Alexandre Juniac give a few comments before we open it up for your questions. Obviously, this is a very interesting week for aviation, with many of the border restrictions within the Schengen region being lifted and aviation restarting. So within that atmosphere, I'd like to invite Brian Pearce, our Chief Economist, to talk about the way forward. Brian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tony, and good day to everybody. So the purpose of this presentation is to provide some analysis showing that this restart period for air travel is actually going to be quite challenging, particularly because of the uncertainty of future demand and where that demand will come for airlines who need to plan their schedules, and also that profitability will be very fragile and difficult in this period. And so, in many cases, in order to survive, airlines will really need the support of regulators and governments to enable them to have the fragility to respond to where consumer demand is taking place. And that support in particular, what is needed is an extension of the slot use waiver. Apologies, I think my mic was muted, but good day, everybody. Let me start by looking at the depth of the crisis relative to what we've seen before. The purpose of this whole presentation is really to make the point that this restart period, as was mentioned, as the industry starts to come back into operation in the third and fourth quarter of this year, is actually going to be a very tricky, challenging period for airlines. They will need to be very flexible and agile to respond to where demand for air travel is arising. Profitability will be under a lot of pressure, and for that reason, they're really going to need the support of regulators and governments. In particular, we're calling for an extension of the slot use waiver in order to give airlines that flexibility. The first point here is that the scale of this crisis compared to previous crises like the 9/11 or the global financial crisis, in terms of what it's done to RPKs, is unprecedented. And in those previous crises, such a waiver was given by regulators and governments. I think the second difference is that in past crises, if we look, for instance, at 9/11 in the green bars, these show the year-on-year change in RPKs in the worst month of those crises. You can see that airlines, at least in principle, had some flexibility and the ability to possibly redeploy aircraft to regions that were less affected by the crisis. That was certainly the case in 9/11, where, for example, Europe and the Asia-Pacific regions were less affected. The feature of today's crisis is, as you can see from those blue bars, the industry, the markets are closed in all regions and are only just started. So there hasn't been any flexibility or ability to redeploy fleet in this crisis. I guess the other point is that future, and perhaps one of the more important points, is that future demand is still highly uncertain. The COVID new cases shown in the bars, have certainly come under control in some regions of the world. But if we look in the aggregate, the health crisis is still far from over, particularly in some important emerging markets. And if we look at the year-on-year change in bookings, there's clearly been some improvement from that low point in April. There was clearly an improvement through May, and we're into early June now. But the level of bookings is still is still 82% lower than it was at this time last year. So demand is still rather weak. We have repeated the passenger survey that we did back in April. And if you recall, back in April, a total of 60% of the almost 5,000 passengers surveyed said that they would intend to travel within a month or two of travel restrictions being lifted. As you can see here, that total, the 12 plus 33, has gone down to 45%. So if anything, consumers have actually got rather more cautious, and actually we've got a majority saying now that they would wait more than 6 months before travelling. So demand is in the bookings is low. Survey is telling us that passengers are rather cautious, and we've also seen a change in booking behaviour as well. And passengers are booking much later, much closer to the timing of the flight than they were before. So these bars show the number of days between booking and the travel date for bookings made in May last year, when airlines, when they were planning their schedules, could see more than 20 days ahead what almost half the passengers were intending to do in that month. And as you can see, the situation today is very different. There's a far more passengers are booking just before the date of departure. 41% are booking now between 0 and 3 days before departure. So the forward visibility that airlines have typically had in the past in their bookings, in the advanced bookings, which have allowed them to plan schedules with some degree of certainty, is just not there today. And if we look at bookings made in May, and these bars show the bookings for the month of travel that are specified on the horizontal axis. The green bars show the situations that airlines would have seen last year as they were planning their schedules in May. And as you can see, the blue bars, which show this year's bookings, show that there's just very little, if any, visibility, and particularly not for the months beyond the summer. And airlines really, for their winter season schedules, need to be planning now, and there's just very little visibility at all. And that was the worldwide picture, but if we go through the regions, it's a very similar picture across all regions, with perhaps the exception of the Chinese domestic market, which has obviously been in a recovery phase for rather longer. But the main point is that there's very little visibility at the moment. If we look at the situation for long-haul travel, this is the booking curve for long-haul travel at the start of the winter season, which is at the beginning of November. And the point here is that at this time of the year, airlines would typically have sold about 14% of tickets to be used for flights in the early part of the winter season. And that's a sort of critical profile enabling airlines to plan their schedules with a degree of certainty. And as you can see, the experience today is that there's just no sign of any rise in the number of bookings. Again, this makes the point that there's no visibility. The problem, though, is not just that passenger demand is weak and very uncertain at this stage. It's also that the profitability of operations during the third and fourth quarter at the beginning of the restart period is going to be very difficult. We can see here that the break-even passenger load factor is going to stay really very high because of low yields and also because of the restrictions that there are on aircraft utilization and sometimes seat utilization because of the health protocols and restrictions. That means that airlines have to achieve load factors of 80% or so in order just to break even at an operating level. And as you can see from the blue line, that is not what we would expect. So, airlines are likely to be continuing to make operating losses during the start of the restart period, which is going to make it, very fragile for them to start up those operations. And I'd remind everybody that, the airline business is a very seasonal one, and typically, and these bars show the situation last year for European airlines, typically operating profits would all be made during the summer period and the majority in the third quarter. And, that is obviously, that certainly has not happened in the second quarter. We know that substantial losses have been made, and the same is probably going to be true for the third quarter unless we see demand picking up very sharply. The consequence of that is that, in the seasonally weak fourth quarter for cash flows, airlines are going to be in a very fragile situation. So we're really calling on regulators and governments to look at extending the slot use waiver through to the winter season, because we still see the weak and uncertain situation of demand. There's nothing for airlines to plan on. But in order to set schedules for the winter season, airlines need to have some certainty in the next month or two, just because of the process that needs to be gone through to put those schedules in place. The risk is not just to airlines retaining their own networks. The risk is, more importantly, for governments and for countries, is that connectivity to long-haul destinations will be at risk. Particularly for long-haul flights, when airlines are scheduling connections where they have banks of flights at hubs, the timing of slots is critical if connections are to be made. So the loss of slots could mean that when we see demand returning to stronger levels, these longer haul connections could be permanently lost. And just to make the point, the scale of this risk, if we look at the number of the proportion of airport pairs that are served with directly, actually that's a very small proportion. 94% of airport pairs depend on connections. So it's the connectivity for a country that is at risk here if we don't see an extension and the flexibility given by an extension of the slot waiver into the winter season. And I will leave it there and back to Tony. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian. So with that, I'd now like to ask Dr. Powell, our medical advisor, to take us through some of the issues involved with testing for COVID-19. So David, over to you.
Thanks very much, and hello everybody. And if I could just have the first slide, please. So I'll try and walk us through the sometimes confusing area of testing for COVID-19. Just to initially remind you what a virus is, it's a genetic sequence, either DNA or in this case RNA. So DNA is a double strand, RNA is a single, and it's wrapped in a protein that has various protein spikes and recognition mechanisms on the outside of it. When we're looking at the types of tests, there are those primarily, the two main groups, those that are looking for the virus and those that are looking for the body's response to the virus, in particular the antibodies. So the viral testing is what indicates that there's virus present in significant quantity in the body, and therefore the person is infected and therefore probably infectious. So that is the key test. That's what all of the testing that has resulted in these 8 million cases around the world depends on. Antibody testing is something that indicates that the body has become infected. And there are a couple of different types of antibodies which can give us an idea of when that has occurred. But the key here is that there's a delay. So you can't use antibody testing for diagnosing cases because you'll miss large numbers. And so if we go to the next slide, thanks, Brian. So the gold standard that we hear about all the time, the PCR test, or its full name, real-time reverse transcriptase polymerase chain reaction, what it's doing is reacting with a component of the genetic sequence. And there are different components that are used, different gene targets, if you like. And what's required is that you sample those and then amplify them and detect them on a molecular basis. Now, most of these samples, the standard again is from a swab which is put in the nose and goes right down the nose to the back of the throat and has to be manipulated around that area to get enough material to be sure that you've done it well. Many of you online will have had a test and will be able to confirm that it's not terribly pleasant. It's not agony, but nor is it something you'd voluntarily do for fun. And so there are some tests being developed which will hopefully be able to use a saliva sample instead, because that's much easier. You can put a little swab in the mouth and take it out again. And you also don't need necessarily a trained healthcare worker to administer that test. So next, please. So what are the requirements for a test in our scenario? Because we know that we've been looking at testing to facilitate air transport really in two areas. So one is, can we make the flight itself safer by testing prior to flight? And the second area is, can we use testing to reduce the chance of importing somebody who's infectious on an international flight? So the first one, they are different considerations, even though they're sort of the same test, the first question is, can we safely achieve the flight without someone being infectious? The second is, can we ensure that they're not introducing the virus to their destination? And our ideal requirements are, firstly, the reliability. Now, if we just look at a couple of the simplest of the parameters of testing, the first is sensitivity. So that's how many of the true infections will be detected by the test as a positive test. So if the test is 95% sensitive, then what that means is that we're only getting 5% of false negatives where we miss somebody who actually has the infection. The next thing, which is probably more important for our scenario, is specificity. In other words, if there's a positive test, how many of those actually represent a true infection? And if you think about testing in association with travel, this is going to be critical for us, because even if the test is 99% specific, that means 1% false positive, and that means on an aeroplane with 300 passengers, 3 of them are going to test positive even if none of them are infected. And that is a significant problem for those people. And the final question, which is crucial for us, is who's going to verify these performance measures? Because it's not good enough just for the manufacturer of the test to claim these sort of numbers. They'll have to be checked out by a public health agency, like, for example, Public Health England, or a therapeutic agency like the FDA in the US, or a scientific one like Institut Pasteur in France. So that's an important piece for us. Next slide, thanks. Perhaps one thing to add there is that there's a rule called Bayes' theorem in medicine, which explains how false positives are more common in a low-risk population. So normally in medicine, we screen to try and only test people who are at greater risk of a particular illness. If you test everybody, as we would be perhaps doing in the travel scenario, then there's a greater risk of those false positives, which, as we said, is a high consequence thing. The second requirement is, I guess, speed and scale together. So you have to be able to, if you are contemplating testing at an airport, either at destination or arrival, you're going to have to be able to process large numbers of tests very quickly and get the results quickly. Technology is developing rapidly, but at the moment it's difficult to achieve speed and scale and reliability all together. And for that reason, there's probably an advantage in testing prior to travel, so that the person who goes to the airport already has their result from the last 24 hours, shall we say, rather than trying to get through all of these at the airport. The next slide, please. And finally, we touched on this, will the testing itself be acceptable to the individual? So not too uncomfortable, ideally saliva, and of course, can we do it without having to have a trained health professional there in full PPE? And cost is a consideration here as well. And here we come into the question of where or at what stage of the journey will we test. So next slide. So on arrival, this has been employed in China and including Hong Kong and Macau for a wee while already, and also has been done in Iceland and a few other European destinations. So you can test on arrival, but a positive test at that stage runs the risk that if it's positive, the traveller and probably the companions will need to be quarantined unexpectedly. So that's a kind of a high risk for them. Testing on departure at the airport is, as we said, running the risk of last-minute cancellation for traveller and companions, but also it allows the all of those tremendous logistical difficulties that we just discussed. And a test on departure still doesn't rule out somebody, a negative test on departure doesn't rule out somebody who's incubating. So you may have recently become infected and the virus is replicating, not yet enough to give a positive test. So you may be on your way to being infectious. So there's a window there. The other option, which I think is more reasonable for us at this stage, is to test before departure. That, of course, allows a window at the destination end where you could become infected after having tested. But nothing's perfect. Nothing's perfect. The other problem with this is that it would require an acceptance by the destination country if it was a condition of arrival in the new country to have a negative test, so that each country would have to recognise the testing that was done in the other state. So next, please. Now, what I haven't really mentioned so far is antibody testing, other than just to explain at the start what it is, but it's not approved for individual diagnosis, and so far the World Health Organization has only really advocated antibody testing for testing large groups, populations or subpopulations, to understand the nature of the spread and the infection. There's been a lot of talk in various quarters about the possibility of using antibody testing for the concept of an immunity passport, but there are difficulties with that, not least is reliability. Another one is the fact that not large numbers of the population are immune, so this probably would only advantage a minority. And then the last one is the sort of perverse incentives, that if you encourage people to have an advantage from having the virus, then you perhaps incentivize them to become infected. And finally, antigen tests. So these are tests that are testing not for the genetic material in the virus, but for the proteins in the coating. And they have potential applicability, but so far perform less reliably than the genetic tests. So, next, please. So, in summary, the gold standard still is the PCR test. So, we believe that if testing is going to be used as part of the travel requirements, it should be viral testing. In other words, at this point, PCR, and we'd be looking for a rapid PCR ideally. Certainly, if the thought is to testing at the airport, then it would have to be extremely rapid and scalable and reliable, but probably those can't be achieved, and therefore it's more likely that you would go for a test that's done prior to departure. and you need some way of being able to reliably record the result in a verifiable manner that's connected to that person's ID. And there are a number of solutions being promoted for that. Note that there's a travel corridor that's been opened between China and Singapore, which actually requires testing at both ends. So this is for business travellers only, but they have a PCR test within 48 hours prior to travel, and then another one on arrival at destination. And then when they come home again, they have to repeat that process. So that's 4 tests and 4 lots of discomfort and 4 lots of cost involved. But that's where we've got to so far with the testing. So that just introduces some of the main principles, and I'll pick any other issues up during questions. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, David. And just to be clear, those are some of the considerations that we have around testing. IATA's position is not to encourage governments to test, but rather if they are considering that testing as a part of the solution to travel, then they need to consider the things that David discussed. So with that, I'll turn it over to Alexandre for just a few remarks before we open up for questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Tony. And thank you, everyone, for joining our weekly briefing. It's an important week for the industry. Yesterday, most border restrictions within Europe were lifted and people are beginning to travel. As we have seen with the first day of operations, the industry is well coordinated with governments. The guidance of both EASA and IATA is being implemented. And we appreciate the patience and cooperation of passengers. With governments, we will continue to monitor the situation to ensure that everything continues to run smoothly as the number of travelers increases. But the reopening of travel in Europe raises 2 important points that we have addressed today. The first point is to remind government and stakeholders that the reopening of borders is a long way off from a return to normal flying. The restart is anything but normal situation for airline planning or passenger demand. Forward bookings into the autumn period are down 82% on normal levels, and travelers are planning for an early return to the skies. Our most recent survey indicated that only 40% would fly within a few months of the pandemic subsiding, and that is down from 61% in early April. This is important not to note because it means that airlines are still fragile, and we continue our call for government relief. Brian has already spoken about the need for a slot waiver into the winter season, the period from October 2020 until March 2021. That will give airlines the flexibility they need to focus on meeting passenger demand as it evolves and free from the burden of trying to protect what their schedule might look like a year from now. The worldwide airport slot guidelines are critical in normal times. They enable airlines to plan their investments and they give consumers certainty. But these are extraordinary times full of uncertainty. The current waiver has been very useful in giving airlines flexibility in the restart, and that flexibility will be the key to surviving the winter season. That's why we are calling on regulators to extend the waiver on a worldwide basis. And we are also continuing our call for other relief measures, including financial assistance in ways that do not increase industry debt levels, extensions to wage subsidies and corporate taxation relief measures, and avoiding increases in charges and fees. The second point that we need to address is COVID-19 testing. Dr. Powell has outlined our position on testing. Most of Europe's governments have not made COVID-19 testing a requirement for restart. That's encouraging and in line with IATA and ICAO guidelines. But testing can play a role as an extra layer of protection for countries where risk is assessed at a higher level. And testing is by far a preferred alternative to quarantine measures, which essentially keep a country in isolation and its tourist economy in lockdown. We have seen a few countries, like Iceland, implement testing on arrival as an alternative to quarantine. The point to emphasize here is that testing before departure would be much more efficient, as Dr. Powell underlined. It would keep people who test positive completely out of the travel system. The challenge, however, is for governments to work together so that testing data from the departure location is accepted by the arrival state. Further, testing will need to cope with growing volumes of travelers. That means delivering accurate results fast and at the scale of airport operations. Progress towards these goals is encouraging, and then the last point that needs to be addressed is cost. Testing should not become an economic barrier to travel. If governments require testing, they must bear the cost. That was agreed by governments in the WHO's international health regulation. So with that few comments, we are ready to take your questions. Thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you very much, Alexandre. So with that, we'll start taking questions. We have a few questions in the queue already. The first talks about, well, I'll just read it out. Could it be that all the coverage of new safety rules, such as the wearing of masks all the time, is lowering demand, especially for long-haul travel? Or is it the quarantine that is putting people off?
It is clear that quarantine is a major deterrent for air travel. It's a blocking system, not only for tourism, because nobody will plan any touristic trip of a 3-week trip to spend 2 weeks in quarantine. And but it's also true for business travel, because usually business travel lasts less than 2 weeks. So it's the quarantine is a much more effective blocking system than any other measure. And of course, we can understand that some health control or sanitary check measures, such as wearing a mask, could be a deterrent for passenger, but not at all at the same level as the quarantine. But on the other hand, we can say that these measures, when they are well designed and proportionate, adapted, is also an incentive to travel again and to take a flight, because it gives confidence, it restores confidence of passengers, and also it allows airlines to gather the acceptance of governments to lift travel restriction and open their borders. So I think the second impact is much higher than the first one.
Okay, thank you, Alexandre. We have a question about long-haul travel. The questioner notes that the White House has recently said that restrictions on long-haul travel will likely be retained for months. And the question is, what is the overall picture for long-haul travel, and how great are the barriers to overcoming to intercontinental at this time?
You want to give our forecast in terms of the profile of our recovery path?
Yes. I think long-haul travel will probably be the last to recover. We are certainly seeing increases in domestic travel, quite strong increases in some markets in Asia. We're now only just starting to see international markets opening up. And you'll all be aware, of course, that the travel corridors and travel bridges and bubbles are taking place between countries that are close by each other. So travel is certainly in the early stages of restart is shorter haul. We will need to see further progress on containing the coronavirus for countries far apart to have the confidence to allow inbound tourists, travellers from distant countries, with the confidence that they're not importing COVID-19. So we would see those markets recovering last, and international travel will probably not get back to 2019 levels before probably 2023 or so.
Okay, thank you, Brian. We have a question about, Brian, your comments about last-minute bookings. And the question is that how much of that is consumer preference versus a function of the fact that airline schedules are also not very stable and perhaps unavailable to be booked earlier?
Yes, it's hard to say with any confidence at this stage. But certainly, what started out as later bookings in the Chinese domestic market, we're seeing that replicated in other markets as well. I think there probably is an element of uncertainty about flight availability, but I do think as well, this reflects a lack of confidence at the moment on the part of the passenger. I mean, whatever the reason, the impact is that airlines don't have any visibility of until the last minute of the strength of demand, which makes planning schedules and allocating aircraft to route networks very difficult, and that's really the sort of principal reason behind our call for an extension of the slot waiver.
Okay, thank you, Brian. We have a question on testing. So the questioner asks, first off, what kind of test cost $150? And the second part of the question is, have we seen any airlines adopt this type of rapid PCR testing that we've been discussing? And I guess just before we turn it over to David for that, just a clarification, airlines are not public health authorities. Our general position on this is if there is testing, it needs to be done by public health authorities, not by airlines. But I'll turn it over to David.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. And that figure I put in was a kind of a mid-range. There's obviously a range of different markets around the world, and there's a range of different tests being promoted, some of them more rapid than others. But just looking at a range of them, I picked a mid-range figure of $150 as being potentially typical. But as to the question about airlines, as Tony says, no airline has voluntarily introduced a requirement to test passengers with PCR testing. And that's not surprising because so far, in general, our observation has been that the risk of transmission on board is low compared with other public places. So we wouldn't see that as being something to introduce for the flight itself. It's more than something that if it can facilitate people's travel and moving from one location to another, then this may be a useful part of that whole recovery. I hope that's clear.
Okay, great. Thank you, David. We have another technical question asking about the ventilation systems on aircraft. We've talked quite a lot about HEPA filters and their efficiency at removing particles, including viruses. The question asks, is that similar for all aircraft, and particularly older aircraft?
Yeah, it's a good question. So just to begin with, remember that the virus spreads primarily by droplets, which are large fluid particles which travel a short distance and then fall to the ground. There's some debate that continues about whether there might be some degree of aerosol, which is much tinier particles which can remain suspended for a longer time or distance. But the bulk of transmission is by droplets, so either by breathing them in or the secondary pathway, which is by touch, droplets to hands, to surfaces, to hands, to face. So that's the mechanism. The risk, if there is a risk when you're in a public place like an aeroplane, is from that direct contact between two people, and it's not from the air supply. So having said all that, now what about the air supply? Well, in all Western modern jets, there's a combination of fresh and recirculated air, because that's a more efficient setup. And the recirculated air all goes through HEPA filters in that grade of aircraft. So older jets, very old, don't even use any recirculation, so they just use fresh air. So again, there's no risk there. So the only category of aircraft where that doesn't apply are some non-Western jets that have a different system, or some turboprop aircraft which can have recirculation without HEPA filtration. And so that the statements that we make about HEPA filters don't apply to those aircraft, but there's still not a viable mechanism for spreading a droplet-carried infection like this. So, so the HEPA thing is reassuring, but really not relevant to the discussion on COVID. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, David. We have a question about transit traffic. So a lot of the measures and things that we've been discussing seem to be primarily focused at origin destination. But how do the measures that are being put in place work when passengers are transiting through hubs and switching airlines and aircraft?
I can try to start with that, and if anybody else wants to supplement, please do.
Yeah,
So every passenger journey involves at least two airports, and all of the measures that are required in the airports, physical distancing, surface, contactless interactions and so on, are required at the destination airport and the arrival, the departure airport as well. When there's a transit, and Brian just said that's 94% of the time, then it's not just two airports, but it's three. So the same provisions have got to be there in the transit airport in terms of all of those things as well. So I don't think it's fundamentally different.
Okay. Alexandre, did you want to add anything to that?
No. I think it is the right answer.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. So we have a question. A question, I guess, about the importance of testing. And it says that many countries are keeping their borders shut due to concerns about imported cases. So wouldn't adopting an industry-wide pre-flight testing standard help resume confidence in your travel?
Yes. It's certainly likely that widespread testing would increase confidence, but it comes at a cost. There are lots of downsides to that, as we talked about, in terms of the price, the delay, the imperfect reliability, and the discomfort of it all. So nothing in COVID-19 is perfect. Alexandre, did you have thoughts?
No. It's true that having a systematic test in a very broad testing system would have some advantages, but as you said, doctors some big inconvenience. And what we think also is that the test systems, or what is available for the moment on the market, is not ready for that. To have a very broad approach. It's not ready. Perhaps in the coming months we will have more availability in our test, more usable, scalable, fast, all the characteristics you mentioned, but it's not the case at this minute. And our position could evolve then, following the evolution and the progress of the testing systems.
Great, thank you, Alexandre. I think it's also worth noting that most of the countries in Europe have reopened without having to implement testing systems. So there's already, I guess, an indication of a high level of confidence in current capabilities, particularly with the ICAO and IATA guidelines. We have a question about aircraft. And it says, does IATA have any data or insight available on how many of the aircraft that were grounded between March and April have been returned to service as airlines are starting to fly again?
So, no, we don't have a precise statistics on that, but the 90% of the fleet was grounded, but the traffic was down something between 80 and 90%. So. And the restart, whether it's in Asia or in Europe, is very has been done very recently. So normally it's a very little part of the fleet that is back in the sky. But we don't have precise statistics.
Great, thank you, Alexandre. We have a question, Brian, to your point about last-minute bookings. Is there any financial impact on the increase of last-minute bookings? And wouldn't it help to increase yields for airlines, as those fares tend to be higher?
That hasn't been the case so far. Airlines, do actually need to recover some of the additional costs that they're facing. The low utilization of aircraft and in some cases low utilization of seats mean that the unit cost, the cost per passenger, is actually higher. But what the experience that we've seen in domestic markets is that airlines really need any cash that they can get because of the costs, but also the debt burdens that they're having to service. And in order to do that, they're tending to price low. We saw yields on the Chinese domestic markets down 40% in order to try and help encourage passengers back on the plane.
Okay, thank you, Brian. We have a question about the measures that IATA is recommending, and probably here, I guess, a bit of clarification is necessary. The questioner says, if IATA doesn't think that quarantines are appropriate and testing isn't ready, what precautions, if any, is it suggesting? And I suppose that would go back to the ICAO takeoff guidelines, but Alexandre, maybe you want to elaborate on that?
elaborate, I don't know. What we are recommending are the CART recommendation that has been worked out under the responsibility of ICAO and with the contribution of WHO, medical specialists, many governments. And we think that the implementation of this multi-layer approach with a series of check and control steps minimize the risk of virus transmission on board and from one country to another. That's our recommendation. We recommend for the states to adopt these measures, for our members to follow the guidelines and the recommendation of the CART, of the takeoff report. That's our recommendation. We consider that quarantine measures are a major obstacle for air travel. So we do not recommend, or we do not ask states to adopt these measures, provided, of course, they implement, the CART or takeoff guidelines. That's our recommendations.
Okay.
And we haven't. Sorry, but for the test, we have said that as long as the testing system is not ready, following the various characteristics mentioned by Dr. Powell, we are not recommending the systematic test for passengers. But if things evolve in the right direction, so if we have a fast, reliable, scalable, acceptable system with a good implementation plan, we could revise our position, of course, following the evolution of science and of technology.
Okay. Thank you, Alexandre. We have a question for Dr. Powell. The questioner asks if it's true that the air quality on an aircraft is at least equal to that of an operating theater.
It's so almost the air supply, the supplied air is almost as good as that's supplied to an operating theatre. The difference is that you have a lot of people in a confined space, and they're quite close to each other, and so that is different from an operating theatre. So you've got not only the supplied air, but also what's being breathed out that hasn't yet been changed. But it's certainly true that there's a very high air exchange rate. Every few minutes, so several times an hour, the air is exchanged, and everything that's recirculated is through HEPA filters of the same quality as is used in operating theatres. So it's close.
Okay. Thank you. We have a question about the Chinese market. And actually, there are two questions on the Chinese market. The first is a clarification on Brian's comment about yields being down 40%, and that's whether or not that's year on year or some other comparison. And the second is we've seen some press saying that U.S. carriers have been facing barriers re-entering the Chinese market. Do we see that more widespread than just the U.S. carriers?
Let me start. So yes, the Chinese yields were down 40% compared to where they were a year ago. So that's a year-on-year comparison, and we're certainly not expecting that to be replicated across the board. But on average, we would expect to see yields down perhaps 18% worldwide this year. And in terms of airlines having difficulty entering markets, we would certainly hope that we would not see any restrictions being put in place. Obviously, we've got the practical issue at the moment is, and the practical challenge at the moment is to see travel restrictions and health restrictions being released in order to allow the restart of air travel services.
Okay. And Alexandre, did you want to comment on the access to the Chinese market?
No, I have no particular comment on that.
Okay. So then maybe we're sort of running out of time, so maybe we'll take one last question. And that question references testing. And it says, how far are we away from testing that meets the requirements of reliability, scalability, and accuracy and speed? Is it 1 year, 2 years, or much closer than that?
Much closer than that. And I think what we were talking about there is the sort of testing that could be done at the airport as part of your travel. But as it is now, you could go in your home country and get a test done the day before travel and have a result the day of travel. That result would be reliable and reasonably affordable. So if a country or a pair of countries were to agree on a testing regime that was instead of quarantine, as indeed the Singapore-China channel have done, that's actually a viable proposition even now. But what we were talking about was the ability to do really reliable, fast tests during the journey, and I think that's going to take a little longer. But this entire field of testing is changing by the week, so this is a much faster paced development than, for example, the vaccine thing.
Okay, thank you, David. Alexandre, did you have anything you wanted to add to that, or? Okay, if not, I think we're just about at the time. So with that, we'll call this briefing to a close.